Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I welcome you to Al-Munawwarah Foundation Ask Research Live session. My name is Lawal Abiodun Fatai. I happen to be the live studio manager. So I have here with me Brother Muhammad. So Assalamu alaikum, Brother Muhammad. Can you hear us? Brother Muhammad.
Wa alaikum assalam. Wa alaikum assalam. I can hear you.
Now, you have the floor now. You have the floor now.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Brother, and I thank Dr. Rasa for having me on this show. So the topic of discussion is centered on. All right, thank you, my brother, Mr. Mohammed. Thanks so much. Yeah, the topic of discussion is the concept of agreement within the context of Islam or Islamic principles, and of course, common law principles. We shall be discussing on what is agreement, what is known by agreement within the context of law. When you're talking about agreement cannot come into existence without a verbal discussion. The first thing that happens before agreement can be conceptualized is oral discussion. Party will discuss, will meet. In the course of our discussions, whatever we agreed upon is what will now be reduced into writing. That is what is known as agreement. So, within the context of the law, we refer to agreements as meetings of the mind of two or more persons or parties, as the case may be. So, agreement is a manifestation of a mutual assent by two or more persons. We call it consensus at the meeting of the mind. It means parties have already agreed to be binded by a concept. That is what is known as agreement. So the first thing is that two parties will need to come together, two parties or more parties, as the case may be. We need to come together, discuss. Their discussion will not be reduced to writing. That is known as agreement. Now, we are talking about agreements within the context of Islam. What does it connote? What does it stand for? In everything we do as a Muslim, it has a spiritual benefit, spiritual values. In Islam, agreements are considered to be so sacred that the content are binding on the parties. That is why in Quran 2 verse 282, Allah enjoins the believers to reduce whatever their discussion is to writing. That when you deal with each other in contracting a debt for a fixed term, then write it down and let a scribe write it down between you with fairness. That's what Allah says in Quran 2 verse 282. That's the longest verse in Quran. Just for us to know the importance of agreement in the life of a Muslim. The way you've accepted the five pillars of Islam is the way we should accept the concept of agreement as well as a Muslim. A Muslim must, as act of ibadah, accept the concept of agreement in his lifetime. Whatever you want to do as a Muslim, you must write it down. That's what Allah says. That is the instruction of Allah. And that has line attuned with the common law principle. Other common law as well, whatever parties have agreed, must be reduced to writing. At any rate, there are two types of agreements. Agreement could be horu, that is faba. But if you're having an agreement, horu alone, there is possibility of misconceptions. Of course, also be binding if it's made in the presence of credible witnesses. But mind you, human being can tell lies, can deny facts. For that reason, it's better for parties to reduce whatever they have agreed upon into writing. Like I said earlier on, every agreement will start, commence from oral discussion. And you now move to another stage of putting into a written form. For instance, you are buying land, you are buying property. Now say, well, we have agreed with other party that and that so person was there when we agree. This is the amount, this is the size of the land, without having a deed of assignment. That's a deed of assignment that will put all these facts into paper form. It will make no sense of the whole thing, transaction. And in legal balance, such discussion cannot be recognized at all. For that reason, at any rate, a written agreement supersedes or is preferable, is better than oral agreement. Like I said, we have two types of agreement, written and oral. Oral could also be binding like written agreements, but we are all advised, even in line with that Quranic injunction as a Muslim, to reduce all our discussions into a written form, a written form. Now we're talking about terms of agreement. What are the things that your agreement should contain? One, we must have parties to the agreement. We must have parties to the agreement. Your agreement must have commencement period. It must be specific. It must be specific. And of course, it has to be a complete, a whole discussion. And whatever you agree upon must be capable of being accepted by the parties. And there must be intention by the parties that we're entering into a legal relationship. And of course, if it has to do with an agreement that borders on property purchase, then there must be consideration. All these are the terms that must be contained in our agreement holistically. We use agreements interchangeably with contracts. Like contracts is specific. Contracts on property purchase is specific. Agreement could be on several issues, on so many issues. Agreement could be on several things. But when you're talking about contract, it's specific. But of course, we use the two interchangeably. Having known what agreement is within the context of common law and within the context of Islam, as I've said earlier on, Quran 2 verse 282 is our reference point and the terms of agreement. We need to know that not all agreements are enforceable. Not all agreements are enforceable. There are some agreements on contracts that are not enforceable. You ask me why? It will shock you to know that if you promise your wife or you have an agreement with your wife that if you cook this soup for me, oh, I will give you 5 naira. I give you 10,000. It's a domestic agreement between husband and wife. That is not enforceable in law court. But in Islam, if you make a promise, you have to fulfill. You can see the distinction. Now, agreement to commit a crime, agreement to commit a crime, it's not enforceable. You can say, Mr. A and B, we are both agreed to go and commit crime, and that the proceeds, this is how we want to share it. Of course, the origin, the beginning of your agreement was based on illegality. So it's not enforceable. Agreement to commit immorality. All these are non-enforceable agreements. Now, what are the things that makes agreement valid? Within Islamic jurisprudence and common law jurisprudence, there must be offer and acceptance. There must be offer and acceptance. Parties to that agreement or contract must have the legal capacity, and the subject of agreement must be lawful. It must be lawful. Like I said earlier on, you cannot agree that you want to go and commit crime and you now want to enforce it against the other party. The law says no. If Islamic jurisprudence says no. And of course, there was the intention from the outset of the agreement that we want to enter into a legal transaction. There must be consideration. Consideration has to be, it could be money, it could be anything. The amount for consideration is not fixed. It depends on whatever parties agree to be the consideration for the agreement. For instance, if I'm giving a property house to an organization, to individuals as a gift, there is no monetary consideration. In that social agreement, there is no monetary consideration. What would be consideration for such would be natural love and affection for that person or for that organization. So if you have an agreement that says, I'm giving out this property to XYZ as a gift, there shouldn't be any monetary consideration there. It has to be in natural love and affection. And it's binding. It's binding. Such agreement is binding. Now, what are the factors that vitiate an agreement or contract? What are the factors that void an agreement? One, misrepresentation. That's why I said earlier on, every agreement started from oral or verbal discussion. Party will have to come to a round table to discuss, okay, this is what I want, this is what I don't want, this is how I want to do it, this is the amount I'm selling. Thereafter, you proceed to go and put into a paper form, a written form. So it becomes binding. Now, if at that point there was misrepresentation of material fact, or the other party suppress the material fact, that we assist the consideration, that we assist the discussion, such agreement will be void or vitiated by the concept of misrepresentation, that the fact were misrepresented to the other party. Mistake. is another point. It's possible party made a mistake while contracting, while discussing. Mistake is another thing. Like, why? I never had the mind of selling my asset. Duress. An agreement signed under duress, for instance, you can't enforce it. Once it's established that at the point of signing or executing this agreement, though, they place gun on that person's head, or the agreement was made under duress, coercion, you cannot enforce it. Undue influence. You use for your position to influence the concept of the agreement. Of course, you cannot enforce it once that is established, that you use your position to influence the agreement. Another thing that can feature agreement is incapacity. Incapacity. Let's assume that an underage, you claim that an underage person signed an agreement. A boy of 5 years old, you claim that that boy signed the agreement for you. That boy doesn't have the legal capacity. He can only act through the guardian. He or she can only, the boy can act through the guardian, but cannot act on itself, on his own. He can't act on his own. The boy cannot act on his own, be another age. So, illegality is another thing. Illegality. An agreement conceptualized on the concept of illegality ab initio is void. Is void. It cannot be remedied. Then another thing, the common day practice is overriding public policy. For instance, parties have agreed, have paid money to purchase a property. There, there happens to be overriding public policy by accusation by the government, fair accusation by the government. Then that argument automatically becomes terminated. Another thing that can terminate agreement or feature agreement is force majeure. Force majeure is a natural occurrence. Parties never envisaged it at the point, at the time they were constitutionalizing the agreement, at the time they were consummating the agreement. They never constitutionalized that. They never envisaged it. There's going to be anything like force majeure. Force majeure is a natural disaster. Earthquake, tornado, that's destroy the property. There's nothing you can do to that. Then fraud. If what was agreed upon was to defraud the other party, then the agreement becomes vitiated. Then another thing, in common day practice, that can also vitiate agreement, absence of illiterate jurors. You ask me, what do I mean by that? You are signing an agreement with an illiterate, and you don't have a provision that says this content, the content of the agreement was read over and understood by the illiterate, and Mr. Sudoso interpreted this to the illiterate person, and he or she understood the content before appending his or her signature on the agreement, and you sign the agreement without putting that illiterate jurat. And that illiterate jurat must come before a notary public or a magistrate. You claim that you have signed an agreement. You have not signed anything. No. You have not signed anything. In the course of my practice, we have set aside some document like that. We have set aside some agreement like that. Because the person you claim to have signed this agreement with is an illiterate. I can't claim that an illiterate understood the content of an agreement that is signed without the provision of illiterate jurors, because that's what we call Illiterate Protection Act. And the same thing goes for a blind man. You are signing an agreement with a blind man. He now put his hand. That is signed here. He signed. Without the provision of illiterate jurats, that agreement will be set aside. Then another thing we need to bear in mind that equally affects agreement. There's what we call common mistake. Common mistake, mutual mistake, unilateral mistake. You can have a common mistake where both parties made mistake at the time we were discussing the subject of transaction, the subject of the agreement was no more in existence. Fire had destroyed the house and you have signed. That was nobody's fault. The seller was not aware at that time, neither the buyer too. Then the agreement become void at that time. Nothing. A mutual mistake occur when the intention of the party, at the point of discussion, when you were discussing, there was no clarity. There was no clarity on what we are selling. Take for instance, I want to sell my Sienna. I have two Sienna cars. I have two vehicles. One is Sienna 2015. The other one is Sienna 2010. My intention was to sell the one of 2010. Now, I said I want to sell my Sienna car. The process buyer now comes forward. We agree. We signed. At the point of executing or the point of transferring, I want to come and take the Sienna. He said, no, you want to pick 2015. It wasn't 2015 Sienna. I had in mind of selling 2010 Sienna. It becomes an issue. At that time, that was a mutual mistake. Both parties come to different conclusions because the intention at the time of